and parents deserve our trust and support for them to do the job that is theirs. Thank you.
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, well, it must be election year.
Really?
Yes, apparently it must be. Labor and the Greens have already rocked up with nearly $750 million of a year of spending ideas, and it isn't even the end of January. Mr Speaker, it must be election as reliable as any other time in this House. The Greens and Labor together want to spend your money before you've even made it, which is remarkably similar, Mr Speaker, to how they've spent their lives historically. And once again, we haven't even managed to get to surplus yet, and they're casting around trying to spend billions of dollars. Why do I say billions? Because it's $750 million, and we're not even at the end of January of election year yet, Mr Speaker. It's like the GFC. Well, no, they're not with the Greens. There won't be any oil. There won't be any milk for that matter either. It's like the GFC never happened. Labor's last big spending splurges were between 2005 and 2008. They dramatically increased the deficit. Remember the decade of deficits they left because the music was never going to stop. They dramatically increased interest costs for New Zealanders, and they put the New Zealand economy into a premature recession. And it's like it never happened, Mr Speaker. And that's the trouble. That's the trouble with this opposition. And Bill English touched on it. There's this willful denial to learn anything at all from their period in opposition. A willful denial to actually learn a thing. I actually think it's quite conceited. They were thrown out not once in 2008, but also again in 2011. They were rejected again, and they come back with the same old policies in 2014, looking for the same old smack around. Mr Speaker, they have not learnt a single thing in opposition. And Mr Cunliffe actually adds an extra dimension to it because he's a bit tricky. He's a bit tricky, our friend Mr Cunliffe, and the journalists are working it out. Because last week, Mr Speaker, Mr Cunliffe was there saying, oh, look, I've just saved $1.5 billion a year, so I'm off to spend it all, everybody. It's all wonderful. So I've cancelled these policies. I now have $1.5 billion a year, a cheque that I can write out. And some of the scribes gleefully reported that that was indeed the case, that clever Mr Cunliffe had saved his $1.5 billion a year and he would now go off and spend it. Except it was never there, Mr Speaker. Except it was never in the country's accounts. There was nothing about GST or fruit and veg in the Treasury projections going out the next 4 years. There was absolutely nothing about the tax-free threshold. But Mr Cunliffe, by cancelling something that never previously existed, has suddenly found himself $1.5 billion a year. And now he says, oh, but that's to do with last election's costings of our economic plan. Well, we know how that ended, Mr Speaker. Those costings in 2011 sunk Phil Goff, Mr Speaker, when he couldn't show us the money, Mr Speaker, in 2011. Whose projections were they? David Cunliffe's projection. So Mr Cunliffe is back, except this time he's kneecapping himself. He should have thought that through, Mr Speaker. So the reality is he has no idea how this Bad Start package is going to work. And I say Bad Start package because you couldn't get a worse start to an election year than an opposition leader who firstly trips himself over the way his package is going to work, and I understand is still doing that as we speak. The package is being redesigned minute by minute, but also has no answer to the question, how are you going to pay for it? And that's the trickiness of Mr Cunliffe, because he's basically saying, oh, everybody, you can have everything that's being done now, and yes, probably some of the green stuff as well, including that nice bit they did yesterday, and you can have the $600 million, and it'll all be sweet, says the Leader of the Opposition. Well, Mr Speaker, he's wrong. It isn't sweet. It wasn't sweet in 2008. After 9 years of progressively worse policies that were about spending more money than the country had made. and it's not sweet to go back to it today. The real answer to lifting Kiwi incomes is attracting investment that boosts jobs, Mr Speaker. And that's what this government is doing, which is another thing. They are Rip Van Winkle on the economy as well. He's gone to sleep in 2008 and turned up with the same arguments for business growth in 2014. Mr Speaker, he says we shouldn't be exporting lamb carcasses overseas. We don't. 98% of New Zealand's lamb carcasses are processed in this country. Wake up, Mr Cunliffe. Life has moved on. We should innovate, he says. We do innovate. We're spending $566 million over 4 years to innovative New Zealand companies, and New Zealand's ICT, high-tech, medium high-tech manufacturing industry is growing like that, and is about to get to the point where it's nearly half already of our dairy industry exports. And that's the reality, Mr Speaker. Dairy, by the way, before Mr Cunliffe gets in with the Greens and tries to shoot it down, is only 20% today of New Zealand's total exports of goods and services. So here we are doing the things that old Rip Van Winkle over there has woken up and said, my gosh, it'd be a good idea if we actually exported something else besides meat carcasses. He needs to do his homework. And that is the conceit of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. They went out of office. They come back today with the same prescription for 2014 as they had in 2008 and 2011. They haven't learnt anything. They haven't bothered to check what's going on today, which is also conceited. And meanwhile, the New Zealand economy is growing strongly, and New Zealand confidence is growing, and the public of New Zealand know that the way to become successful is to keep doing the things that this government has New Zealand doing. And that's the focus that this government has, Mr Speaker, and we have the greatest level of confidence since the 90s. We have the greatest level of growth, one of the greatest levels of growth across the OECD, and likely to continue. It's not nirvana yet, but if you give us another 3 years, you never know how far you'll get. But what you do know with the Labor Party is you go backwards to a bunch of failed and rejected policies, Mr Speaker, that were rejected in 2008 and rejected again in 2011. What we do need to do is continue on the considered, sensible, conservative path where we understand that there's a balance between spending and people's incomes. We understand that you actually have to reward people for their own hard work. You have to trust them with their incomes to make good decisions. Those are the sort of things you have to do, and you have to do good public services. And I was bemused to see another one, Jacinda Ardern up there before, going on about how we'll get prison populations down. Well, hello, we've done that, Mr Speaker. While she wasn't looking, in 2008 we inherited a prison population projection like this, and now it's like that, and crime levels are at record lows. Meanwhile, Jacinda's picked up the 2008 election plan and says, oh, we better protest about the state of the prisons and how too many people are going to be in the prisons. Believe me, Mr Speaker, these people need to update what they know. And sadly, I don't know what they've been doing in the last 5 years, but they haven't been updating their knowledge at all. They haven't been learning what's happening in the world today, and they haven't been learning what's working, Mr Speaker. And this government has been getting on the job with the job of improving public services, of delivering far better results than Labor ever managed with their avalanches of money, of getting on with building a strong, competitive economy which supports and encourages investments in competitive Kiwi businesses, of frankly balancing the books, getting rid of the decade of deficits, and getting New Zealand into a position where we can have a strong economic future in this country, and above all, rebuilding our second largest city. And yes, we get an economic benefit of that, this country does, but by goodness, we got the economic pain of that in 2010 and 2011. And for Mr Cunliffe in his conceited manner to wander around and say you should discount the growth of Christchurch, well, that involves basically discounting the pain that Christchurch went through as well, and we cannot do that, Mr Speaker. So yes, there's some benefit in that, but if he thinks it's about a milk and Christchurch story, then frankly he is damning the efforts of many New Zealand businesses up and down the country who are competing and succeeding on the world stage. This government supports those people, Mr Speaker. We're providing a platform for growth and competitiveness from this little country at the bottom of the Pacific, and the opposition needs to wake up and decide they need a new song.
Green Party will split their call. 4 minute bell. Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Kevin
Speaker.
Haig.
and Happy New Year to you, sir. It's just a shame that we had to start the parliamentary year with such a disappointing